Again, this is Bob Hendershot, and he's going to be talking about grazing grasses and soil pasture health. And folks, if you have questions during this chat, I encourage you to type them in the chat box, which is at the bottom of the screen. If you hover down there and you click on that chat box, be able to type in your question, and Kathy Smith and I will be monitoring those.
So do you see my screen, folks?
I do, Bob. I think you need to make it so it's in slideshow presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe from the beginning, if you scroll over. There you go. Right there you go, Bob.
You gotta be patient with me. My machine and I both go slow. All right?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, we'll start here. We're talking about managing our native warm season grasses, and they're totally different than what we typically think of our cool season grasses: tall fescue, orchard grass, bluegrass. Those are what we in the plant world call C3. That means they take 3 carbon molecules to make the sugar molecule in the photosynthesis process. Our warm season natives, and all warm season grasses, corn being a warm season grass, uses 4 carbon molecules to make sugar. So it's a little more efficient. And they digest a little differently when they're eaten because of that complex 4 carbon chain, if you will. So they actually have a little more energy in them in the fiber part than our cool season grasses. They're a little more what we would call energy dense for the ruminant animal. And just to see what they look like side by side, that's fescue on the left, our native warm season grasses on the right. And this would be like a midsummer picture. So the fescue's slowed down or almost has gone to seed and semi-dormant, not growing very fast, where our natives warm season grasses are just in the peak production during the summertime. Then in the fall, this time of year, having a little light frost last night, mine are starting to turn. So they do like warm temperatures. And when we get a frost, they're like the trees, they'll turn brilliant colors for a grass sky. We like the pretty colors that the natives give us. So, but they're still valuable as a grazing product at this time. Animals can still utilize them. There are good environmental considerations with the natives because they're very deep rooted, so they help us with soil erosion. They provide some excellent wildlife habitat because they tend to be a little taller. And then they're just, like I said, there's some people think they're just pretty to look at, and they kind of wave in the wind when they're growing. So it looks like a green sea. If you have a nice field of native grasses or even annual warm season grasses, it looks like a field. To get you a picture of what they look out, this is big blue stem. At the vegetative state, all these will be in vegetation, but round tree is one of a dominant one. There's getting to be a lot more different cultivars of the native grasses. 30 years ago when I started working and talking about them, we only had about a half a dozen total between all the species. Now we have a dozen or more of each one of the species that are available to us in terms of varieties. Rumsey Indian grass. Indian grass has done very well this year. This has been a great Indian grass season, and it's a thicker, denser grass, not quite as palatable as the round big blue stem. And then by far the biggest dry matter producer is the switchgrasses. Blackwell is more of a forage type. There's several different types of switchgrasses. Blackwell is one of the lower forage types, more leaves, less stem. As you get to the taller ones like Caven Rock, they tend to be more stemmy or stemmier. And this is a field of eastern gamma grass. It's truly a big bunch grass, grows up out of the ground a little bit, very bumpy to drive over, if you think, but it's very, very palatable. And it's a very high in sugar. It does excellent for putting weight on cattle. In the wintertime, they tend to look like this. That's why a lot of our wildlife people, friends, like them, because it provides good winter cover. They'll stand up under snow and provide a lot of good habitat, winter habitat for some of our ground animals, rabbits, even, and the birds especially. My family loves to come to my farm and hunt rabbits in the switchgrasses because it's just full of rabbits there when it looks like this. You got a little snow on, they're just everywhere. Diversity, I like to see mixtures of the natives and even cool season grasses. But if we can keep a diversity of different plants out there, it gives us a little more diversity in terms of the growing condition. I already mentioned that this has been a great year for Indian grass, not so much for big blue stem, but so the Indian grass has done very, very well. There's other years that switchgrass does well and the other ones don't. So if you have all 3 or 4 of them on your farm or in the field, one of them will do very, very well. Then if we can get into managing the grazing, and I talk to people about dividing their farms up in their pastures into multiple grazing units or paddocks. Think instead of one pasture, you had 10 different grazing paddocks. That would mean you're only grazing 10% of the grazable area at a time and resting 90. And if you get somebody like me who has 40 some paddocks or more, then we're resting over 90% of the grazing area or 90% of the farm at any one time. Then we're only grazing 5 or 2% of the farm at any one day. Now we may be we'll move around and we'll graze it all, but at any one time we're resting a lot of area. And that's the secret of any good grazing system is the rest period. These native plants are what was here when the native animals or the buffalo were grazing, and they would graze it maybe once or twice a year and then the rest of the year it'd be rested, even though there were no fences out there. Now, one of the problems with the natives many people have is says they're slow to establish. Well, if we do a good job, and I use this one to talk to my friends that have hard time, this picture was taken on July the 12th. The field was planted on May the 26th. So in 7 weeks, you can see the rows of the native grasses out there, up over that. So it can establish fairly quickly if we buy good seed and do a good job of planting and preparing the field ahead of time. We can get a good stand. Then this is taking the following year on July the 5th. The following year, that was 98, this is 99, same field. I don't know if you can see that little barn in the background. That's the same barn that's in the background there. And you can see the establishment of that new stand of warm season grass. That is a beautiful stand in 1 year that got established. So now, if you take hint of this, what's in the foreground or mid foreground there is a cultipacker. And that's a very important part of having this. These are seeds that need to have seed soil contact. And if we can get a cultipacker over that field, even if you drill it, still pull a cultipacker and maybe in multiple directions, to press the seed into the soil. And you'll get a much better stand, even if you drill it, if you utilize that cultipacker. Then when it gets to this stage, it's time to hay and graze it. Of course, being the grazing guy, I like to graze it, but it can make good quality hay. And if you think this is, again, in July, the foreground are native warm season grasses, haven't gone to seed yet, so they're still in the vegetative stage. And if you look in the background of what our cool season grasses would look like, they're headed out and have started to desiccate, meaning turn brown. And many, many years, there's a lot of hay made in the state of Ohio that is brown. Of course, those guys say they make first and second cutting on the same day in the same field. But think of what the quality would be of that warm season grass. So if you have trouble getting hay made on time, the natives give us that opportunity to make high quality hay when we can make high quality hay, usually in that first week of July. Grazing it. Here's where we're grazing it on a paddock grazing system or short intensive grazing system. In this case, we had 29 cow-calf pairs and a bull on a 2-acre switchgrass paddock for 4 days. For 4 days, 2 acres supported 30 head and the calves. That's a lot of grazing in a small area. So you can see what they were eating. Usually we think we can handle about 1.5 animal units per acre and not hurt the wildlife potential of that. The nesting period, if you're worried about, or if you have nesting birds, say the quail or the pheasants, you may want to reduce that grazing during that peak nesting period. Move a little faster, move a little quicker, not quite as tense. Then when nesting's over with, you can come back and graze it a little more intense. You'll still have a lot of vegetation out there to graze. And this is a big blue stem. And we're going to leave 8 to 24 inches behind. That's our residual stubble. So we manage these totally different than we would a tall fescue or a bluegrass stand pasture. There we take it down to 3 to 4 inches. Here we're going to leave 8 to 24 inches of stubble behind. And that's because these plants are much taller. So we're still taking off the same percentage of forage of the plant. It's just the manner in which we're doing it. Here you can see them being moved from one paddock to the next. And this is a stand of switchgrass that we've turned. These are mama cows. You can see them see the backs of them in the background to get an idea how tall they are, how tall the grass is. These are normal sized cows. So it may be, 4 or 5 feet tall if it gets away from you. It would have gotten away from us, and we probably have a little bit of concern there. If you're a summer calver, it makes a great calving area. Now, not if you want to try and find that calf and put a tag in its ear, because they'll be hidden pretty good, but it makes an excellent spot for a mama cow to drop a calf, and it'll stay out of the flies and out of the sun, and it's shaded, and so it makes a real good pasture area for calving in the summertime. Production-wise, these are the dry matter yields, and it does range. If you look at switchgrass here, I said it's probably one of our more productive ones. A lot more work's been done on switchgrass. Here in '99, we had over 4 tons, 3.5 in 2000. Big blue stem, very similar, not quite as well in 2000. And then when we blend it all together, you can see we can get a better and longer, if you look at the amount of grazing days that's taken, harvested, if you will.
Hey, Bob, Bob, real quick before you move on, I got a question here. Okay. How do you control reed canary grass that has infiltrated native grasses?
What's my native grass? Is it a mixture?
They don't say.
Okay. It'd be difficult to control the reed canary grass. I would probably try and do a dormant spray if it's a real issue. And when the reed canary grass is actively growing, but my natives haven't yet in the spring of the year, it'd be a very narrow window, because reed canary is one of the last cool season grasses to break dormancy. What if the other one would be what kind of reed canary it is. If it has a high alkaloid, they'll tend not to want to graze that as hard. So that could be difficult. Never had or seen that situation. Another one would be a fire. And that's where we go in and do a controlled burn, which would hurt the reed canary grass and benefit our native grasses. So this is, I do controlled spot burns. That's what I just burn small areas, 100 square feet at a time in a different field. And the natives really respond to that. And our cool seasons, other grasses and other plants don't respond well to fire. And this is a fire typically we're doing in April. So it really stimulates the native grasses to grow. That's how they developed in nature, is through fire, the use of fire. So that would be another option if they have the capability of doing a controlled burn. Got to be careful these kind of days talking about fires, I guess.
Right.
But I just got off doing a webinar with some of my Western friends, and that's some of their problems why they think they have so many wildfires out west, is the fact that the controlled fires have been reduced so greatly that they haven't been able to control some of the fuel loads. In the past, 20, 30 years ago, they would always be doing some controlled burns, reducing the fire loads, and we didn't have these massive fires like we're seeing today. In terms of wildlife, if we stock too dense, we can have some problems with nesting, but typically cows do not step on ground nesting bird nests. Now, if we push them so tight that they have no choices, but understand birds are not afraid of a cow. But if you walk out there, many times you get within 25 feet or 50 feet of a nest, the bird takes off and leaves the nest. Cow can walk up and graze right beside a nest, and that bird, that hen, will stay right there on the nest. They don't see the cow as a threat or a predator to her nest, whereas many of us, they see as a true threat to their nest. Haying is another option. It's an easy way. That may be another way to help with that reed canary grass, is to graze it or to hay it. Usually you can think of getting 2 to 3 tons, making that first cutting in July or earlier. And then my switch grasses, I usually got 2 or 3 cuts off of them every year. Now I just graze everything and don't do any hay. You need to put a push bar or something out in front of the mower or the hay bind to kind of scare any or hens off a nest so you don't run them through there. You'll destroy the nest, but hopefully you can save the bird and get them to go off. But it makes it nice. You're mowing it up high and you're laying that forage right on top of an 8-inch stubble, so it's not laying on the ground. So you got air underneath and on top of the forage, windrow, so it dries very quickly. Our native grasses have hollow stems, so they dry even more quickly. And so it makes excellent hay. So in terms of this, typically we like to cut the interior of the field and go out. I know most farmers like to cut the outsides and move to the center of the field. But if we ought to get into the habit of mowing our hay fields from the inside out, and that forces the animals in the hayfield to move to the edges. When you start on the edge and move in, you end up with them all in the center and there's no place for them to run to. Native warm season grass hay makes excellent hay because there's no dust or very, very little, if any, dust in it. They use it a lot out west in the feedlots. That's the hay they introduce new calves to because it's a high quality hay. They call it prairie hay out there. And a lot of the feedlots like to start their new cattle when they get them in on prairie hay because it gives them something to chew and it's very clean and palatable and makes good. So I usually stop and talk about grasses with this quote from John Ingalls. Grass is the forgiveness of nature, her constant benediction. Its tenacious fibers hold the earth in its place, we would call those roots, and prevent the soluble components from washing into the sea. That would be the nutrients in the soil particles. It invades the solitudes of deserts, climbs inaccessible slopes, and forbidden pinnacles of mountains, modifies climates, determines the history, character, and destiny of nations. But grass yields no fruit in the earth or in the air, yet should its harvest fail for a single year, famine would depopulate the world. That was written in 1872, right after the Civil War. I get a lot of comfort from that. Let me see if I can get to my other PowerPoint here. How much time I got?
To the end.
To the end.
Yeah. But I could listen to Bob all day, actually.
All right. Healthy soils. Are your soils healthy or unhealthy? And then what is the living portion of the soil? What do all soil tests show? What determines the potential agronomically of your soil? And the answer to all those questions is soil organic matter. Hopefully you can see my screen, Carrie, can you?
Yes, Bob, I can. Looks good.
All right. So if we look at soils, I studied soils in college, so soils are dear to me. If we look at soil properties, they can be classified into chemical, physical, or biological. There's three aspects. So when I was in school, you had soil chemistry, you had soil microbiology, and you had soil physics. The engineers always studied soil physics because that's where you got into compaction and bearing strengths and what the soil could bear when you started putting loads to it. Soil chemistry, when I was in school, was soil fertility in terms of chemical fertilizers. The soil biology dealt a lot with the things we couldn't see, the soil microbes. We can improve soil physical properties with tillage. That's why but there are also some chemical things, looking at the calcium magnesium ratio and humic acids, the biological building characteristics of humus, that organic matter part, can make the soil more resilient and softer, if you will. That's what makes that soil crumble, is the soil organic matter. Chemical properties, we look at cation balancing, the effects of calcium. If we have low calcium levels in our soil, many times our soils have poor soil structure and tilth. They tend to be tight and sticky and crust. You usually have more weed pressures. When I go out and walk fields, especially pasture fields, and look at some of the weeds that we have, many times they're an indicator of low soluble calcium in our soil. Usually when we have low calcium, we have higher nitrogen needs. So calcium is one of those things we look at in our chemical characteristics of the soil. Soil biology, the whole secret here is feeding the microbes. That's soil life. That's inside the soil that we don't see. We feed that soil life with the plant roots. And of course, it's the roots that are leaking, if you will, sugar water, or the sugar that the plant makes up in the leaves transposed down to the roots. That's how roots grow, is from the energy from the plant roots. And then the more diversity we have in the fields, and I realize corn farmers don't like diversity, and soybean growers, they want just their plant out there. But in a pasture field or a hay field, the more different varieties or species we can have, usually the better soil biology we're going to have. And temperature makes a difference, which in terms of how much is available, especially if you look at phosphorus. When the temperature increases, available phosphorus gets better. That's up to a point. If it gets too high though, then it goes back the other way. So when we get around 70 degrees is the ideal soil temperature and what's making that phosphorus available? It's the soil organics. The biology in the soil is like when it's down around 50 degrees, when we plant corn, usually only 20% of the phosphorus is available. time the corn is up and actively growing, we're around 100% of now the phosphorus. Even though the same amount of phosphorus is in the field, it's the availability to the plant. So chemistry of the field, that soil test, also has to be tied to the biology of the field and how it works. In terms of my grazing systems, if we overgraze or graze too tight, you can see this one where we have ample forage and green leaves out there. The soil temperature is 77 degrees on a hot August day. You get over here, even with a mulch or a lot of dead residue, it's over 90 degrees. And the biology isn't working because it's getting too hot. And that's one of the ways we kill microbes is with heat. That's the reason we cook our meat to 160 degrees, is to kill the microbe. So when we get it over 140, the bacteria begin to die. When we're down around 70 degrees, 100% of the moisture in the soil is used just for growth. When we get much over 100, then most of the moisture is used through evapotranspiration and evaporation, and only 15% is used for growth. So we lose a lot of that moisture that's available, that's in the soil, to the physical composition of it. The biological parts of the soil, we use them all the time. That's why we inoculate soybeans, we inoculate clovers and alfalfa with rhizobia bacteria to help fix nitrogen and convert nitrogen in the air into organic nitrogen that's available for our plants and reduces our needs. If we have a good pasture field that has 30-35% by dry weight legume in it, that will provide nearly all the nitrogen we need for our forages. High rates of residue will be degraded when we have good bacteria, and we can start to build that soil organic matter in the system. If organic matter builds soil tilth and aggregation, I always like to dig. If you've been with me on a field walk or a pasture walk or out in the field, I almost always have my spade or shovel with me, and we're digging up soil, looking at this right here, looking at the activity going into the soil. When it crumbs apart like that, and we have actively growing roots, we can have a better biological soil. We hold more water. Water tends to be one of our limiting resources in growing plants. And if we have more biology in the field or in the soil, our plants tend to be healthier because it's just like probiotics for us. If we get off, our stomachs get messed up, one of the things we do, or if we have a sick calf that's got scours, many times we give them probiotics to get the right flora and fauna growing back into their guts again. Same thing with the soil. We need to get the right amount of flora and fauna growing back into our soil. A healthy biological soil has a whole lot fewer insect problems and nematodes because the beneficial fungi and bacteria ward off the harmful soil bacteria and fungi. Understand a lot of our microbes secrete hormones that make our plants grow and be healthier. So there's a whole lot going on in the soil biology wise that we're just now starting to understand and learn. Then I'll ask the question to you all, how did nature make all that soil in the first place? And if you thought about it, especially if you think about the Midwest, it looked like this. So this is a manipulated one. Why are all those buffalo in that middle strip? If you look at the top, that's actually the strip that was burnt. These are native warm season grasses. They burnt that strip. That's the best regrowth coming back, and those buffalo know where the best grass is. In the foreground was a strip they burnt the year before. In this case, they burn every 3 years in a different location. So next year they'll burn that top strip. And there's no fences out there. those buffalo are finding the best grass and are managing it. When nature had natural wildfires, the buffalo would always naturally follow the fires the following year, because that's where the best grass would be, because it stimulated those grasses to grow and had the most soil life in there. Whoop, did I go the right way? Nope, I went to, need to go the other way. So many times we're trying to look for soil that helps build the soil, or soil, we're looking for trying to build healthy soils, and building organic matter in there is how we do that. So I've always liked this question on how do we heal the land. If you have bad soil or soil that needs a little rehab, if you would like to use that word, should we buy fertilizer and lime? Remember, we should consider those capital investments, but our tax laws treat them like an annual expense, so we write them off every year. But lime and fertilizer actually is there for longer than a year, so it's not just an annual thing. So that's where our tax laws aren't in sync with nature. How can we improve our soil without purchasing things? And Alan Savory will say the only tool known to heal the land is animal impact. Alan is one of those landscape managers. He uses animals to replenish I can't say the word, expanding deserts. He tries to shrink the deserts by using animals. So if he can bring in a lot of cows, a lot of animals, get them to, and of course they have to bring in feed, but once he can get them started dunging and urinating and hoof action and sloughing off hair and salivating, that saliva on the ground, all that builds a healthy soil. It takes animals to build that soil back, and it turns green. Once we get it green, we got cover, we cool the site down, it starts retaining moisture instead of giving moisture off. In many cases, he's been able to build soils back. And I've talked about water and that organic matter. Our typical Ohio crop field and pasture field has about 2% organic matter. And on an acre basis, that'll hold about 32,000 gallons of water. On my farm, a 10-year storm is 3.7 inches. That varies throughout the state, usually from 3.5 to 4.5, depending on what part of the state of Ohio you're in. And this is the amount of rain over a 24-hour period, not a single storm, but what would fall in a 24-hour period. So that's typical parameter the Conservation Service uses to design a lot of their conservation practices, is the amount of runoff that comes from a 10-year storm. And that would be the biggest storm in a 10-year period. So this summer, or late summer, early spring, we had a 4.1 inch 24-hour rainfall event here in Pickaway County. And we had some runoff events. If you think about that, 5% is what we're encouraging farmers to get to with no-till farming, with good pasture management. And there will hold 80,000 gallons of water on a per acre event. If you think about that, understand that an acre inch, a 1 inch rainfall on an acre of land is around 26,000 gallons of water. So here we're going to hold about 77%, almost 3/4 of that rainfall will land on there. And now 8% typically is what many historians think is what our soils were at before we started farming them. So in the 1600s, 1700s here in Ohio, our soils would have had around that 8% organic matter. That's 128,000 gallons of water. That would mean we'd have no soil or no water runoff from a 10-year storm. The soil would be able to hold all the rain from that once in a 10-year storm. So we wouldn't have much in the terms of flooding if we would get our soils and build our organic matter at that level. So it makes a big difference in the amount of organic matter in the soil and how we can make it work. We look at grazing and hay fields, and we can build and try to improve our soil health by managing, by disturbing less. Every time we disturb the soil, we're burning organic matter. It's kind of like stirring the embers of a fire, your campfire. It blazes up and burns faster. Every time you stir or mix the soil, disc it, hoe it, plow it, you're adding oxygen to it and you're burning off organic matter. So in a pasture field, we tend not to do that. Diversity is critical. Having more different kinds of plants out there or that are rooting at different depths, feeding different microorganisms, and makes the system work. And I talk about feeding soil livestock with a living root year long. And one of the things I've been talking about this summer with some of my students is the fact that we talk about our crops and forage systems are alive how many days out of the year? 365. Corn plants alive how many days? Actually, we sell corn by the number of days that it's alive. So 105, 110, 120 day. Think instead of 365, only 120. Look at soybeans. How many days are soybean roots actually alive? Many soybean roots are already starting to die as the plants are beginning to die. So once those plants are dead, they're no longer feeding the microbes in the soil because the roots are not active anymore. They're not giving off the sugars that they leak out into the soil to feed those soil microbes. Another one is keeping the soil covered. Don't overgraze. Don't cut your hay too short, like we talked about in the last session. Try to keep some cover out there to keep the soil cool. If we get the soil too hot, we're going to kill a lot of the microbes. So we want to keep the soil cool and moist and actively so we can have a good, healthy soil. I'll stop there, Carrie. If there's any more questions, I would have a tendency to go on and on.
Does anyone have any questions for Bob about grazing or summer annuals or soil health? Natives? There were a few questions about native grasses, but Mark Salk answered those. Thanks, Mark.
Ah, good.
I don't see any more questions.
Big blue stem, yes. Wonderful.
All right. Well, thanks, Bob. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And again, that's tuned in. We have sessions all week long through the Gwen and through the agronomy area and the other areas of the Farm Science Review. So tune into those. A lot of the ones on the Gwen are pre-recorded, so you can watch them. And then if you have questions, most of the speakers have put their information in those presentations.
Oop. Thanks to Kathy and Carrie for hosting us all.
Thank you, Bob, for doing. Appreciate it.
What's on the schedule for tomorrow?
Let's see. Forages tomorrow. We've got a live session in the morning, grazing and soil health with Dave Libben. And then at 11 o'clock, it's grazing management through the eyes of the animal. That's Mark Salk. That's pre-recorded. And then the grasses you ought to be grazing, native warm season grasses with Jason Jones. And then getting involved with the Grassland Council with Gary Wilson. Gary. Yep.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good one. Thanks, Kathy.
See you, Carrie.